back, Monona!
If I step back, he steps in.
And I'll step where you stand.
Good. Make room beside the word no.
The desert didn't so much stretch as shimmer heat wavering like breath over glass, the horizon sliding back each time he tried to meet it. Stones glinted like broken promises. Sage stood brittle, waiting for wind that never came. High above, a vulture turned slow circles, marking the hour. Travis Harlow walked alone, broad-shouldered and unhurried, a man pushed hard by thirst, but not yet beaten. The sun had peeled his skin to parchment. His tongue cracked like old leather. 3 days without water had made his breath taste of dust and iron. His shirt, once blue, now bore the colors of survival rust, sweat, and the dark bloom of a bullet wound through his shoulder. His right hand hovered near his revolver. Some instincts live longer than men do. He spoke a name into the heat. Rebecca. It burned there a moment and was gone. Then another. Matthew. He saw their faces not as they lay, but as they had lived, and the mercy of that vision nearly killed him because a man must choose which world to walk in. The ground rose without warning. His boot scuffed rock, his knee found it next, and then the rest of him. He lay on his back and watched light pour past the sun like a spill that would not stop. He thought, there is a last breath, and perhaps this is it. He closed his eyes to make room for it. A shadow crossed the light, not cloud, a woman. At first she was only a shape against the blaze, then a face under a hawk feather braid, cheekbones cut from the same stone as the land, eyes the brown of water at depth. She crouched and studied him without hurry, the way one watches a snake to see if it means harm. His hand twitched toward the gun. It made it as far as the buckle. He could not lift it again. She unwrapped a glass bottle. The smell came first, a sweetness that nearly broke his heart. Then the chill of glass at his lip. He took a sip and the heat inside him screamed. He coughed. She drew the bottle back, waited, angled it again. Patience is a kind of medicine. He learned that in the space between drops. Enough, she said. Her English was careful, each word set in place like a stone. He nodded because nodding was less than speech. She offered an arm, a small arm, wiry as green wood, and pulled until he stood. The desert sloped cruelly, and he listed. She took his belt with one hand, looped his arm over her shoulder with the other, and moved him toward a seam in the rock that had been a shadow too thin to notice. The cave was no more than a room made by God when he had a moment. It held the cool like a kept promise. Bundles of herbs hung from cracks. A low fire pit waited with yesterday's ash. Clay jars lined the back wall like men who had learned to stand quietly. She sat him on a flat stone and gave him another mouthful of milk and the warning that went with it. Slow, she said. He drank as a man kneels. The first real breath landed in him and steadied the world enough to see her. She wore deerhide, beaded in small patterns. A shawl even in the heat, because the body is a map, and some places need covering. A leather thong looped her hair. Tiny feathers brightened the braid like small birds come to rest. Name, he managed. Monona, she said. Then, after a pause, as if reminding herself of the shape words make when told to strangers, widow. He tipped his head to one side. Sheriff's training. Questions come on their own. You? She asked before he could. She had seen the badge, tarnished, but still star-shaped on his vest. Travis Harlow, he said. Silver Creek. Her mouth made the smallest line. Something like weariness crossed her face when she looked at that star. She turned away, opened a clay jar, and mixed a paste in a shallow bowl of stone. A sharp smell rose. Herbs and something bitter that lived in the ground. This will burn, she said, and pressed it into the wound with fingers that knew the difference between necessary and cruel. He bit down on his breath and let the fire roll through him. He gripped the stone seat until his knuckles showed bone. The burn climbed and then eased, like a storm that has delivered its message. Through and through, she said. Good. No digging. She bound him with clean cloth. You live if you stop moving like a fool. He would have smiled for that if the muscles were willing. Instead, he closed his eyes and let the cool walls hold him. The sound of her work flint, a soft rush when tinder caught, the mild song of water heating filled the room. Wind spoke low at the cave mouth. He drifted to the edge of sleep and heard one more word before he went. "Stay," she said, which is a kind of mercy when the world has specialized in sending men away. He woke tonight. Firelight put red on the rock and gold on the woman's hair. She sat cross-legged mending a strip of leather, bone needle steady. He reached for the cup she had placed near his hand and drank the water that tasted faintly of flowers. "How long?" he asked. "Half a day," she said. The sun went down. "Feels like I left a horse behind me." "Good." "You did," she said, not unkindly, and he understood that she had seen more than his wound. He told her a measure of his story, because telling is sometimes the only way a man can keep company with himself. He named Callaway and his boys, and the bank in Silver Creek and the banker's daughter, who cried until she didn't. He said horse when voice shook, and left out the part where the sun sat on his chest, and asked if he still wanted to live. She listened like the land listens. No small noises, no rushing in to fill the silence. When he finished, she banked the fire to a low amber and leaned back against the cave wall. Shadows nicked her cheek. Her hands lay quiet on her knees. "My husband," she said after a time, and stopped there. He nodded. Some grief needs a short word and a long silence. He gave her both. Outside, a coyote drew a line under the night and left it at that. He slept and did not dream. Dawn came as a soft place on the floor where the light touched. He drank, ate a thin stew that tasted like hunger leaving, and felt his head lift of its own accord. When he stood to test his legs, she watched without moving. He passed the test poorly and put a hand out. She did not take it. She slid the water skin and a length of dried meat across the stone to him, then stood, tying her shawl with a simple knot. "We look," she said. "For what?" "For men who want to finish a job." They moved carefully along the rocks to a ridge that offered a view of the flat miles. The morning was a mercy heat not yet sharpened, air that had not turned to glass. Monona walked like she belonged to the land, and it to her. Travis followed at a pace that kept his heart from stepping into his mouth. From the ridge, the world resolved into its parts. Low scrub that drank shadows, ribs of stone emerging where the earth had been worried thin, a dry wash that ran crooked as a lie. Far to the west, a faint thread of smoke rose and leaned. Monona pointed with her chin. "Camp," she said. "Could be Callaway," Travis said. "Could be traders or my people," she said. Only one way to know. He felt the old draw, the part of him that wanted to go see and make a truth obey. He touched his shoulder and reconsidered the costs of that kind of knowing. Later, he said, "If we're going, we should go where walls are in our favor." She looked at him. "Walls?" She did not say the word, as if it were a solution. "An abandoned fort," he said. "Stone, 15 miles northeast, maybe more on foot, well inside. Good sight lines." He thought of the men who had built it and the things they had not understood about where they stood. "Bad history," he added. "Good position." Her face closed like a book to save the place. "It is on ground my people kept for the dead," she said. "Soldiers put stone where prayer already was." He waited. The wind ran a hand through the brush, and the brush did not mind. "We go," she said, "not to hide, to guard." His body objected on several fronts. His mouth said, "All right," and meant it. They broke camp without the need for talk. Monona gathered herbs and medicine into a pouch of deer hide, took down dried plants that had been curing in the cave, and folded them into cloth. She left the place as she had found it no scrap, no ash that a wandering eye could call a mat. Travis checked his revolver, slid cartridges into the loops he had sewn months ago, and never imagined counting here. When she handed him a walking stick, he took it without pride. The desert made its old demand. Carry only what you cannot leave. They walked in the early light, took shade when the sun turned ornery, moved again, as if tied to the low arc of the afternoon. Monona showed him where the barrel cactus would hold a sour mouthful for men who needed to keep a heart going. She set snares near a little seep that let a lick of water through a crack, then marked the place in her mind and in a way he could not see. He watched the way she read the ground-broken twig, a soft place in the sand where a rabbit had thought itself unseen, the language of tracks that the law taught him in town and the desert taught here. They came to a shallow depression where thorn gave way to shy green. She knelt, cut a cactus, and pressed wetness into his palm. "Drink," she said. He did. It tasted like the last thing a desperate man might drink. He blessed it anyway. "How long have you been alone?" he asked, when the weight of the question got too heavy to carry unspoken. She set the knife down and wiped it clean on grass that grew in the small grace of damp. "A year," she said. "The army came. They were looking for men who had taken something far away. My husband stood between rifles and children. The rifles had more to say." On grass. He stood there, hat in his hand, because some sentences require a bare head. He did not reach for her shoulder. He let the air stand with them and be counted. They set snares, took the shade of a rock outcrop that held its cool like an old story, and waited for something to move that would be supper. Heat buzzed. The kind of silence that deepens when two people have told the truth between them settled into place. "Why a badge after they died?" she asked at last, not unkindly. He started to say words about law and order and the comfort of shape. He let them fall unspoken. "If I said it was to keep other men safe, it would be a good story," he said. "Sometimes stories are tools. The truer thing is, I needed a room with rules. The farm was full of ghosts and no rules at all." She nodded, as one who had found similar rooms. "Rules are only as good as hands that hold them. Mine shake more than they used to," he said. "Then use both," she said, which was not a joke. A snare twitched. She was on it quickly, a rabbit in her hand and the end that comes as merciful as possible. He watched the competence of it and felt something like gratitude toward a world that still contained skill used to keep breath going. When they came back to the cave in the shallows of evening, heat had let go with a last insult. Monona built a small fire where the smoke would find the crack and leave without telling. The stew held rabbit, and a handful of plants he did not know, and something from a pouch that turned the taste into a secret. He ate until the ache quieted. She took from a basket small flowers not yet dry. She crushed them with careful thumbs. "Tonight is full moon," she said. "We speak to those who have crossed. You can speak if you like." "If I like," he repeated, and felt the rough of that. His body remembered the shape of grief. His mouth did not yet. They climbed a little to a stone circle that had been arranged before either of them were living. The moon rose like a coin polished with the thumb. She burned herbs that changed the air. She drew lines of color across her face and gave him the bowl without telling him what to do. He followed because following is sometimes the only way to tell respect from curiosity. "Talk," she said, "not to him but to the dark where names live." He told Rebecca the simple things, that he had carried wood alone and burned it badly, that the garden went to weeds but the soil had not forgotten, that he had taken work that brought the kind of sleep a man can stand, that his guilt had not made the bed he slept on, though it tried. He told Matthew that the trick with the string and the top still worked. When he stopped, the wind lifted once and put itself down somewhere east. "They heard," Monona said, as if reporting only what her eyes could see. They were walking back when the shadow at the cave mouth fell sideways to the ground, with a sound a man makes when his body has more holes than blood. Monona was ablaze before the light could lay claim. Travis's revolver was in his right hand without consultation. The man lay on his side, buckskins torn, hair stuck to his forehead with sweat. He opened his mouth and pulled two words up from a long draw. "Eli Carson," he said. Then, "Callaway." Blood told its own story. The bullet had gone in and stayed to make trouble. Monona set water to boil, and laid out needle and thread, iron and leaf, paste and prayer. She cut, found the metal that had lectured bone, pulled it into the world, and stitched the road it had taken. Travis kept watch at the mouth of the cave and counted the stars to stop from counting the screams. No riders came. The wind kept its appointment and left again. Near dawn, when the heat broke and the cold remembered, Carson's fever started to turn small circles. His eyes opened to the fire's low breath. He looked at Travis's star and frowned. "Law," he said. "Sometimes," Travis answered. "Callaway has a map," Carson said, as if he were telling the truth to the only piece that could stand it. "He thinks Apache gold sleeps under the very ground the army cursed. He will wake it with fire." And Monona wiped sweat from the man's face and wrung the cloth clean. "There is no gold," she said. "Only sacred." Carson shut his eyes and opened them again. "Sacred is a word for the kind of gold you can't spend," he said, and the fever had done him the favor of being honest. "We go to the fort," Monona said, "before he does." 15 miles northeast, Carson said, "because maps live behind the eyes of some men, even when blood goes missing. Water halfway. A ridge with a view if you know where to stand." He slept then because the body insisted. Travis looked at Monona and saw in her face the mirror of his own vow, only older and better kept. "Let's go," he said, and the desert nodded to itself. It likes a plan as much as any other god. They left at the gray edge of morning when color hides and shapes speak for themselves. Carson could walk, but only the distance between two stubborn breaths. After that, one or the other had to wait. They made a litter from 2 saplings and Travis's old coat. Travis and Monona took the ends. The desert took the rest. By noon, the sun had located its temper again. They took shade, then gave it back. Monona knew a spring that came out shy at the foot of a black rock. They drank and filled skins and laid wet cloth on the man who had not yet decided whether to live. Travis brought the revolver into his lap and checked each chamber, because care is a ritual small. Circles the hands draw to tell the mind there will be an afterward. "Why did you become law?" Carson asked later when his eyes had steadied enough to aim words. "Instead of a farmer who remembers his dead and tries again." Travis considered the lure of the small life, the way dawn walks out of a field and puts its hands on a man's shoulders like a friend. He considered the silence in the bedroom where a dress still hangs. "Because the farm was a room with their names on every wall," he said. "The badge was a room with rules and no names. At first, that felt like breathing. After a while, it felt like sleeping on a floor." Carson nodded as if he had seen similar floors. He shifted. Payne looked at him and he looked back. "I was hired to make maps," he said, "for men who pretend maps are a way to know a country instead of a way to own it." Monona watched a hawk draw a wide circle and let that drawing be her answer. They moved again when the sun lowered its hand. The hills finally admitted they were hills, not just the idea of them. Stone walls came up like old shoulders. The desert began to thin and then thicken again with a different kind of plant. Toward evening, they found a depression tucked out of the wind where the sound of the day could climb down and rest. A fire, as small as need, warmed the edges of them. Monona fed Carson a tea so bitter he called it by a soldier's name. She told him, without warmth, to be grateful. "Your husband," Travis said when the fire had gone to embers and the night had made the decision to stay, "what was his name?" "Out," she said. "Restless one." The light made her profile into a relief. "He wanted a world that did not make us choose between love and our people. He thought if he stood long enough, both sides would come to him. He died standing." She did not cry. She looked into the space above the embers where flame had been and spoke like a woman not finished with love. Travis let the ash give off the sound ash gives. He told the story of a fever that took quick and a father who came back from hunting to a still house. He told of a neighbor woman crying on the porch like grief were a language one could pick up from listening. He stopped before the part where he had slept on the kitchen floor for 2 nights. Because the bed could not hold only one body. They did not say sorry. It is a word that sometimes only serves the one who says it. They offered silence, which feeds both. Near dawn, Carson sat up with the look of a man who has remembered something the body had hidden from him. "Not just gold," he said. "Callaway took papers in Silver Creek Military, routes and names. He will sell them if he can. He will sell anything. Travis looked to the east and found the thin blade of light there. He turned the information over in his mind as one turns a coin that might be counterfeit. It did not matter, finally, whether for maps or graves or the kind of secrets that get men killed in bundles. Callaway would come. It was enough. They reached the fort near noon on the second day. It rose from the mesa like a story men tell to prove they were here. Stone walls 12 feet high, corners squared to a world that had never been square. The main gate yawned open, its wooden teeth long since pulled out by wind and time. Inside, a courtyard where weeds had taken to keeping accounts. Low buildings around the edges, barracks, storehouse. A small room whose door held a carving that did not belong to the army. Monona saw that door, and something in her shoulders changed. She pressed her palm to stone at the lintel and waited. Then she pushed the slab that was not a slab, and a seam opened into stairs cut into the earth. The air from below came up cool and dry as a hand you trust. Travis stood at the top while she lit a lamp with oil that had waited for this job. She went down first, and he followed, because the law knows when to be student. The chamber was round and made by men who understood the kindness of curve. The walls held the story of a people, paintings of hunt and song and seasons, patterns that made their own language, shelves cut for the bones of those who did not belong to the ground so much as the ground belonged to them. Silver had tarnished to a gray that still kept the shine under it. Turquoise did not forget the sky. He took off his hat without thinking. Monona set the lamp where the light could be itself without noise. She did not touch anything. She did not need to. She had already told the room the one thing that mattered, that she had come to keep. When they climbed back into the light, a whistle carried across the courtyard, thin, urgent, agreed upon. Travis went to the eastern tower and took his eyes as far as they would go. 6 riders approached from the south, a loose wedge with a man in front who wore a red bandana and the confidence of a thief. Callaway. They come, Travis said. Then we prepare, Monona said. They set about turning the fort back into what it had once been built to be. Travis dragged timbers and broken doors to the gate and made a mouth that did not enjoy the idea of swallowing men. He cleared the towers and tested the angles where a rifle could ask its question and expect an honest reply. Monona found the well and drew water dark as coins. Carson, color returned to his face by some measure of stubbornness, loaded Travis's spare rifle and showed where a man could lie invisible to a horseman and still see the whites of his teeth. By late afternoon, the heat had gone polite. The riders came on and did not bother with curves. Callaway raised a white strip from the end of a rifle and made as if talking were an act of charity. Travis stayed on the wall, stone chest high, hat pulled down enough to give his eyes shade, and his mouth the courage to speak plain. "That's far enough," he called. Callaway rode forward a little for the theater of it. He was a big man, made bigger by horse and Sunday. His beard held crumbs of gold from weeks of riding east and robbing what he found. His smile held a dozen small crimes. "Sheriff," he said, "I am pleased to see you less dead than reported." "Reports are lazy," Travis said. "What do you want that you didn't steal already?" "A fair question," Callaway said. "Here is a fair answer. I want what you are sitting on. I know you have a guide who knows where the dead sleep. Send him out with his map, and we will let the rest of you live." Travis heard the click of Monona's breath behind him, not fear. More the sound a blade makes leaving a sheath. He looked down at Callaway and moved the brim enough for the outlaw to see his eyes. "No," he said. "Then I burn your house and scoop ash into my pockets," Callaway said, cheerful as a salesman. "There's more than old beads under there. There's coin enough to clean a man's soul. Even the army built their fort over it to keep the shine for themselves." "It was not built to keep shine," Monona said from the stair of the tower where the stone met the sky, "but to make ghosts." Her voice carried clean, and Callaway's horse shivered in the same moment, his face tight. Callaway turned his head and let his smile go hard. "The widow," he said. "I've heard of you the one who thinks mercy is offense." He looked back up at Travis. "You have until sundown." He wheeled his horse and rode back to his men with that flourish certain men spend their lives practicing. The six withdrew to a ravine that offered shadow and angles. They dismounted and settled into the kind of patience bad men learn when they like the results. Dusk lengthened. The sky took its time, as if remembering how to become night. On the northern ridge, a line of small fires sparked to life 15, perhaps more spaced like beads on a cord. Monona's breath left her and came back changed. "My people," she said. "They saw the smoke I sent." "They'll fight?" Carson asked, voice low, a man's soul being weighed on the back of a word. "They will stand where the line is," Monona said. "If it is crossed, they will move." That was answer enough for any country. The fort settled into the page of waiting between one paragraph and the next. Travis walked the wall and let his boots tell him where the stone was weak. He checked on Carson at the gate and nodded when he saw the man breathe without counting. He stood with Monona under the chapel's lintel and felt the weight of earth under his feet, the kind that marks a place as anchor. "Thank you for showing me," he said. "It is not shown," she said. "It is kept. For tonight, you help keep." Quote, "Tomorrow?" he asked before he could stop the word. "Tomorrow," she said, and did not promise anything more. They came at true dark, when the air holds its breath and sound carries differently. Two men first, fast for the gate with bottles lit from the two small fires they'd made to justify the night. The bottles broke on stone and went to flame along the old wood. Carson shot and shot well. One man fell, one wheeled, caught a timber with his knee and tumbled out of the saddle with a grunt that ended soon after. Monona had water and blankets at the ready. She and Travis beat the fire back until it sulked into smoke. Callaway's men shouted something about cowards on walls. The walls did not answer. Stone has manners like that. A pause. Then shots from the ravine toward the northwest tower, high and wild probing. Monona returned two measured answers that asked more than they gave. Silence moved in again like a guest invited for the night. "Two down," Carson said from the gate, voice just loud enough. "Four," Travis said, counting the leader. He tipped his hat up and peered toward the ridge, where the fires had gone to red eyes. Shadows moved there, with a discipline that comes from the kind of practice no one wants. Near midnight, a shape detached from the dark beyond the gate and came forward with hands raised. Callaway, hat off, head lifted like a man in church. "Parley," he called. "Just me." "No," Monona said before Travis could speak. Travis watched the man's walk. There is a geometry to deceit. Callaway stopped, where a cautious man would, and offered a smile that had sold many a lie to men more rested than these. "I am disappointed in you, Carson," he called toward the gate. "I told them you used to be helpful." Carson laughed once, short, and with no mirth in it. "You left me with lead in me," he said. "Men tend to remember their teachers." Callaway's shoulders rolled what a man does when he cannot change a truth and wants to look like he could if he wanted to. "Last chance," he said. "Give me the widow. Give me the map. Keep the lawman if you like. I care only for what pays." Travis lifted his revolver enough to mean something. "You'll leave without what you want," he said. "Or you'll leave inside someone else's horse." Callaway's smile drained. He turned and walked back, casual for the first 3 steps, and then not at all. He had come to look. Now he knew what he needed to know. The second attack came at dawn, the hour when men mistake light for advantage. 2 at the southeast corner, 3 from the ravine, 1 wide along the west wall, where a narrow spill of rock might have offered a climber his small hope. The watchers on the ridge began to move, and their movement changed the equation before a shot was fired. Arrows first soundless, quick, eloquent, then rifle fire from angles the ravine did not comprehend. Travis took the southeast tower and made lines between breath and trigger. A man at the ravine lip stood to shout something, and the air beside his ear turned to dirt. He fell like a sack and rolled out of sight. At the gate, Carson was half standing behind the barricade, his face steady in a way that suggests either courage or stupidity. On this morning it was courage. His shot took a horse at the shoulder. The animal screamed and lay down on its rider. The rider stopped arguing with the world. Callaway understood then. He saw that numbers do not count the way they do in a town. He saw his men looking to him and their eyes saying what they did not dare speak, that there are fights you lose even when you are the meanest man present. He snarled the way a boy might when the game stops going his way. He pointed at the chapel without knowing what it was and shouted a word Travis couldn't hear. He ran at the gate. Some men run because forward is the last direction they believe in. He was one of those. He leaped the barricade on foot with a grace that surprised even him. Travis fired. The round took the revolver from Callaway's hand and turned it into iron noise. Callaway rolled, came up with a knife, saw the door with the carving and made for it. Monona stepped into the doorway. Until that second, Travis had not known what a human body could look like when it was a line drawn between a sacred thing and the man who would touch it for money. She did not crouch. She did not raise her arms. She stood and let the word "no" be as visible as flesh can make it. Callaway paused, just the blink you pay for when you are too used to the world making room. That was enough. An arrow from the ridge stitched the air beside his ear and took a strip of hat and scalp with it. He screamed in a way that removed the last of his dignity. He lunged, knife low. Travis came from the side, bad shoulder screaming, good hand steady. His shot took the knuckles of the knife hand and left them in the dirt like old bones. Callaway fell to his knees and spat a word that had no God in it. He looked up at Monona with eyes already rehearsing their lies. "Mercy," he said. She looked past him to the open door and the dark that kept what it had been keeping long before either of them were born. "Mercy is for the living," she said. "You have lived very long already." The watchers came down then, 15 men and 2 women, hair black as wings, faces set to a work as old as breath. They ringed the courtyard, and the fight ended the way a light ends when a hand covers it. By noon, Callaway and the 2 men who still wanted to argue had their hands tied and their eyes made to look at the ground. The others were laid out beyond the wall. The ridge folk spoke with Monona in words that moved like water over stone. An elder with hair the color of weather stood before Travis and looked into him long enough to see he would not look away. Then he placed a hand just above the sheriff's wounded shoulder and took it away. It felt like a check mark in a ledger. Carson sat against the barricade, sweat clean on his face. He had bled again, but not in a way that denied him coffee. Monona brought him a tin cup and watched him drink. When he finished, she took the cup and said, "You will live if you stop doing things that make you die." He nodded, chastened by a small woman with a nation at her back. They kept vigil the rest of the day over the prisoners until the sun moved enough to make another choice. Over the fort until the last hot places cooled. Over the door to the dead because keeping is a job without a clock. At evening, the elder returned with small bundles wrapped in deer hide. He placed one on the stone beside the chapel door and spoke to Monona at length. She listened more than she answered. When he had done, he touched her forehead with 2 fingers, blessing or acknowledgement. Travis did not know and turned away. "What did he say?" Travis asked. "That the caves will be closed again, deeper," she said, "and that I may return when my feet are done with wandering." She lifted one of the bundles and set it in Travis's hands. "For you," she said. He unwrapped it. Inside lay a strip of beadwork, colors like sunset and river, and a small disc of hammered silver with a hole for a thong. On it, someone had stamped a simple thing, a wind line, 3 curves, the old mark for breath. "What does it mean?" he asked. "That the wind remembers," she said. "Even when men forget, they stayed 3 days to do what must be done." The watchers sealed the stair with stone that could move again if the right hands asked. They took the prisoners away on a trail that only men who loved the land could learn. They left no fire uncooled, no footprint that pointed. By the time the moon grew thin, the fort looked like it had decided never to remember. On the morning they left, the sky wore a color Travis did not have a name for. He saddled the horse the watchers had traded for the rifles they collected from the dead small economy written without coin. Monona tied her pouch tighter, set her shawl, and looked once more at the door that was no longer a door. "Back to Silver Creek?" she asked. "They think I'm dead," he said. "A man ought to correct that." She nodded and said nothing about what a man ought to do next. They took the track north until it bent east. Carson rode with them as far as the spring. He reined in there and sat a long time with his hands on the horn, not so much holding the saddle as holding himself to a decision. "I'll take those papers to the soldiers," he said. "The right ones, if the army has such a thing." He looked up at Monona and tried on a smile that fit better than it would have a week ago. "If I come back west, it will be without a shovel." "That is a good way," she said. Carson held out his hand to Travis. "You don't shoot like a lawman," he said. "You shoot like a man who has something to keep." Travis took his hand. "Maybe I learned." They let go. Carson turned his horse and made a line toward the part of the world that still pretended to be straight. By afternoon, the country softened sage to grass, dirt to road. The smell of water changed from miracle to fact. Silver Creek lay in a bowl of light, small as the memory of a song. Dogs barked, the way dogs do when the dead walk down Main Street. Travis left Monona at a stand of cottonwoods where the river slowed and turned in on itself. 3 days, she said. "I will be here." He went into town with his hat low and his name intact. He stepped onto the plank of the jail and opened the door on dust and a chair that still held the shape of his weight. He took off the badge and put it on the desk, which is a way of telling a story without words. He wrote a letter in a hand that had learned to be careful and left it under the star. He walked back out into the kind of quiet that comes when men agree to be surprised together. "Sheriff," the blacksmith said finally. "For another hour," Travis said, "maybe less." At dusk, he found the river again. Monona stood in the water to her ankles, where the current wrote small lines around her. She did not turn when he came. She did not have to. 3 days? He asked. 3, she said. They camped in cottonwood shade. They did not build a big fire. They had no need to tell anyone where they were. He brewed coffee that tasted like a past made safe by distance. She sang a tune about rain finding stone. He asked what it meant. She said, "It means we are still here." They spoke of what comes next, the way tired people talk around the thing until it shows its face. The badge on the desk. The fort sleeping. The watchers keeping. The man who would take orders from the letter and do the job with a smaller hand. The woman who would go to her people and test whether belonging can be made after grief. "You could come," he said at last. He kept his voice gentle, so the word would not feel trapped. "I could," she said, "but not today." "That's enough," he said, and he meant it. Night thickened. Coyotes wrote their looping signatures on the dark. The river made a small sound at the bend as if remembering a joke from long ago. They lay down not close and not far, the ground under them familiar finally. Her hum came and went, a line the wind learned and kept. At dawn they stood. He buckled his belt. She tied her braid. There was an almost smile on her face, the kind that belongs to the first second after a choice, and before the weight of it settles. "The wind remembers," she said, touching the silver disc at his throat where he had tied it on with a piece of rawhide. "So do we," he said. She turned east along the river, feet quiet as a deer. He watched until the cottonwoods gathered her up and kept her. He waited one more moment past the one that hurts. Then he turned west toward town. By late morning he reached the jail. The star lay on the desk where he had left it. He pinned it on, not like a yoke, but like a thing a man can carry, until the road opens in another direction. He stepped outside into the street and looked at the line where the sky met the hills. The wind moved down Main and found the disc at his throat and made it cool. He raised his face to it, closed his eyes, and let the air go through him. Somewhere, far off, a hawk tipped one wing and corrected its course. He opened his eyes and started walking. The day went on. The town resumed itself. The desert waited with its old patience. Above all of it, the wind moved, remembering what men forget and forgiving what it can.